Well, howdy friends, Brian Flechsig of Mad River Outfitters and the Midwest Fly Fishing Schools, and welcome back to another one of our fly fishing tutorials. And today, I want to talk a little bit more about Airflo Poly Leaders. You know, in spring of 2025, we've spent some time with our great friend Tim Flagler from Tightline Video. You all know Tim from the Orvis podcast, from his work with Tom Rosenbauer, and of course his wonderful work at Tightline Video. And Tim and I spent some time this spring fishing wet flies, and you've maybe seen some of the videos here on our channel. We've been talking about wet flies, we've been tying wet flies, and then we went down to the Great Smoky Mountains and spent some time with our dear friends Ian and Charity Rudder from R&R Fly Fishing Guide Service, and also talked wet flies, fished wet flies, we tied some wet flies. So 2025, I'm going to declare is the year of the wet fly. And I couldn't be more thrilled about it. You're going to hear more about it. You're going to see more about it. And I'm going to tie so many wet flies that you're going to be sick of them. If you don't like wet flies, turn this off right now. But make sure you subscribe first and then come back when we talk about, you know, what's your favorite fish? So anyhow, let's talk about poly leaders. In a couple of those videos, I talked about the fact that I was fishing Airflo Poly Leaders. And I want to clear up some of the confusion and talk a little bit about the loops on the end. And then I want to talk about the importance of this monofilament connector. So many people have reached out with questions, which of course we appreciate. And remember, always send your questions to admin@madriveroutfitters.com. Airflo Poly Leaders, they're basically, it's kind of wrong to call them a leader. You've all seen me harp about the fact that a leader equals a tapered butt section plus a tippet section. That tapered section has to be tapered, third grade physics, and that tippet section is the thinnest part of the leader, and it is to which you're going to attach the fly, of course. So to call this a leader is not 100% correct. This is a tapered butt section that you are going to have to attach tippet to. Okay, so this is not double tippeting. Double tippeting, you can't have two tippets. I mean, you just can't. A leader equals a tapered butt section plus a tippet. If you pull a leader out of a package, it has a tippet on it. If you add another tippet, you have two tippets. So double tippeting is pretty bad, and it's going over here in the bad, not so bad. I've told you don't add tippet to a package leader. Well, this is just a tapered butt section, just to be clear. And they make these poly leaders in two lengths. There's the 5-foot length, and that refers to the length of the butt section. It's 5 foot, and then they also make 8-foot lengths, okay? So it's just a butt section, and you're gonna have to add tippet, or you're gonna have to add kind of a compound tippet, so to speak. You're gonna have to add a piece of transition and then to your tippet. And we're going to talk about that here in just a second. So the first thing talking about these poly leaders is a lot of folks chimed in on our videos and they said, well, this has a loop on the end. So of course, as you've taught us all, you cut the loop. No, you're not going to cut the loop on this. It is just not necessary. And there's really no way that I can nail knot this thick poly leader or snell this poly leader to the tip of my fly line. That would just not be practical. It would not be durable. I mean, that would slip right off. And there's no reason for it. I mean, these, for the most part, I a lot of times use the sinking versions, intermediate and sinking versions of these for fishing wet flies. And it does not hinder my casting at all. I mean, when I'm target shooting at a bonefish, a redfish, a permit, a tarpon, or a carp, well then sure, I'm going to cut the loop and build a proper contact leader. This is a totally different game, okay? And I might be switching these out. I might swap these out 6, 8, 20 times a day, okay? If I get to a particular run of water and I look and I've got the extra fast, of course I'm going to carry a selection of these with me when I'm wet fly fishing. If I'm fishing the extra fast sink version of this and I come to a shallow riffle, well then I might want to switch over to the intermediate or the light sink version of this. So I'm going to carry a selection of these poly leaders with me, and if I had to nail knot or snell that onto the tip of my fly line, I would ruin a fly line in no time. And I would never, ever get to fish. I would spend my life tying knots. That's just silly. So loop to loop in this case is absolutely, totally acceptable, and it's necessary. And for those of you that call that hypocritical, I don't think it's hypocritical. I've made many videos where I told you there is a time for loops and there's a time for snelling or nail knotting a butt section onto the tip of your fly line. Okay, so you're definitely going to want to use a loop-to-loop system, whether you use the factory welded loop that comes with your fly line, or if you don't have a loop on the end, of course, you can snell the proper stiffness of butt section so you get a good belt curve. You can snell on a connector piece and tie a perfection loop. It's that simple, and now you have an instant connector piece there that you can now go loop to loop. And remember, the proper way to do loop to loop, you want to go the line, the loop in the line, through the loop in the leader, or in this case, the butt section of the leader. So we go line through leader, and then leader through line, and then your poly leader is attached. Super easy. And like I said, you can easily swap that out. So you're just going to push them apart, take it out, usually take the tippet with it, although sometimes I'll reuse my tippet. You just coil this up as you would any normal leader, starting at the thin part, and then wrap it up, and I put it back in my leader wallet, and then I'll attach the proper sink rate for the piece of water that I'm fishing. Now, I mean, don't get too worried. You're not going to spend most of your day just changing leaders all the time. I mean, there are some days where I do it quite often, and some days where I just pick the extra fast sink or the fast sink, and I just fish them, okay? But it's super, super easy. So that's you do not want to cut the loops off. There is just no practical way to snell this or nail knot this on. And plus you absolutely have to have, if you're going to do this right, you're going to have the simplicity of going loop to loop with this system. So let's talk about the front end of this poly leader. And on these poly leaders, again, they have a monofilament core, and I just did that completely wrong. Okay, so when you buy these poly leaders, again, it's just a butt section. And let me say this, y'all have heard me say this before, there are shops and there are companies out there that are going to try to tell you that this is a poor man's sink tip, that you don't have to buy a sink tip fly line, just loop this onto your existing weight forward floating line and presto, like magic, you have a sink tip fly line. That is absolutely not true. I mean, this is a sinking butt section of a leader. This is not the tip of a fly line. I mean, people tell us that all the time, that such and such shop said, well, just get one of these poly leaders and then you don't need a sink tip. That's absolutely not true. They have really different uses. I might use this for streamer fishing if I'm fishing a streamer on a 4-weight or a 5-weight and I'm fishing very shallow, clear water where I want to make a more delicate presentation. But under no circumstances is this replacing a sink tip fly line? So there's my rant for the day. So this connector piece, it has a monofilament core and then the polyurethane coating from Airflo over top. Approximately 6 inches or so of this connector piece is going to be exposed. And what I typically do is I tie a perfection loop in that in the moment that I buy it. Okay? And now every time you put on a new tippet or a taper, further taper and tippet, you're not cutting into this connector. And literally, I rarely, if ever, go through this connector. So I tie a perfection loop. If you don't know how to tie a perfection loop, there's a link right there. If you can't see the link, it's down in the description. And now, when you build your tippet or your taper and tippet, you can tie a perfection loop there, and then again, it's just loop to loop, making sure this becomes your line now, and you go line through leader, leader through line, and you get that proper handshake tippet. So, but it's very, very important to understand what this connector is, okay? Now, I'm going to come right back to that. They make poly leaders in, at least the ones that I'm using for wet flies, they make them in the, okay, purple is
trash.
Out of here. Purple, yeah, I've known that for weeks. I was teaching a school a couple weeks ago. I tried to use the purple 4 different times. Okay, here we go. They make the poly leaders in the light trout. Again, 5 foot or 8 foot. And then they make them in the trout version. So the light trout are for 1 to 4 weight rods. And the trout are for 4 to 7 weight rods. Okay, I fish wet flies a lot on 4 weights, 3 weights, 4 weights. Sometimes, depending on where I am when I go out west, I might fish a 5 weight. So I do carry both light trout and the trout poly leaders. Now, they also make them in floating. And I do use these. I love the floating poly leaders, and I fish them for large dries. And especially, I love fishing grasshoppers and foam type flies on the floating poly leaders. I don't often fish wet flies, though, on floating poly leaders. Okay? Floating poly leaders are going to be primarily for dry flies, which, by the way, for you, for bass anglers, they do make a bass version of these. I think they're 4-foot butt sections, and man, they actually work extremely well for poppers. So the floating is not really going to apply to what we're talking about here today. So they make intermediate. No, they make hover, which the hover just breaks through the surface film and it's kind of neutrally buoyant. So it's designed to kind of hang a fly right below the surface. So if you are fishing like emergers and such, these hover leaders can be helpful. They are really good for fishing lakes when you've got chironomids and midges that are hatching in lakes and you're trying to fish a midge pupa just below the surface. Again, I rarely use them in streams and rarely use them for dry flies. And I can tell you a lot of other folks agree because they don't sell much at all. I mean, we sell like under 20 of them a year. And then we move into the intermediate. Now, the intermediate sink rate sinks relatively slowly. They have then, I think they call it the slow sink. They have the fast sink. And then they have the super fast sink. And it should be fairly explanatory: slow sink, fast sink, and super fast sink. So these are the ones here that I use most often when I'm fishing this style of wet fly fishing. And again, I might change between the different sink rates over the course of a given day as I'm moving into different water depths and different speeds. I probably find myself fishing the fast sink the most often. Fast sink is kind of my go-to, kind of my default. If it's sinking too fast, I can always cast a little further downstream so it doesn't sink as much by the time the fly starts to swing through the zone. So again, made in floating, kind of a different story. The hover, kind of a different story. If you're fishing, using these for wet fly fishing, it's the intermediate, the slow sink, the fast sink, and the super fast sink, which the fast sink being my default, my go-to. Okay, so let's get back to that connector. Okay, for the light trout, that 6-inch connector, and by the way, this is on our website, by the way. If you read through the description on our website, this information is there, but a lot of folks don't read, and a lot of folks don't even know that the information is there. So that 6-inch connector for the light trout is 2X, which is 0.0099 thousandths in diameter. Okay? The 6-inch connector for the trout is actually 0X, which is 11 thousandths, of course. Okay, so that's what diameter that 6-inch connector is that you're going to tie a perfection loop in. And this is so wildly important. So if you're building a tippet section, okay, and you're going to go to, let's say we're fishing the light trout, and the light trout has a 2X connector. Well, first and foremost, you need to make sure that you're thinner than 2X or thinner. You can't tie on 1X. Remember, you can't ask a skinny kid to push a fat kid. So we can't tie on a piece of 1X tippet. So it has to be 2X or lighter. So if I'm going to use a 2X tippet, that's fine. You can just go with 3 or 4 foot of 2X tippet, and now you've got an 8 to a 9 foot leader. If you're using the 5 foot version, you add 3 or 4 foot of 2X, and you've got an 8 or a 9 foot leader. But let's say you wanted to fish 5X tippet, okay? So this little connector piece is 2X. Well, I'm going to build myself a tippet. I'll tie a perfection loop here so I can go loop to loop, and I'm probably going to go either 3X, maybe 6 to 8 inches, and then I'll go to the 5X tippet. I really don't want to go from 2X to 5X. That's skipping 2 diameters. That's skipping 3 and 4, obviously. And that's going to create a hinge, okay? And it's especially if you're fishing a brace of flies, you're fishing 2, maybe even 3 different wet flies, that's going to create a hinge, and that's not going to cast well. So if you just give yourself this little 6 or 8 inch connector piece of 3X and then down to the 5X, okay? Just as a general rule for myself when I'm doing this, I typically don't like to skip more than one number, okay? So let's say, for example, if I was wanting to go to 6X, well, I would never fish wet flies on 6X, but let's just say that they were a little tiny for the sake of education, little tiny little dry or wet flies. I would want to change this connector to 4X. I'm skipping 1, 2 to 4, and then 4 to 6. That would work, but you've got to have this little connector. If you just attach the 6X to the 2X, that's going to be a horrible hinge, and it's just not going to turn over for you. It's going to collapse into a big pile, okay? I hope that makes sense to y'all. So same thing, and it might even get a little more challenging for you when that connector on the trout on the standard trout, which is again for 4 weight to 7 weight, is 0x. So now we have 0x 11 thousandths. So let's say we wanted to go to a 4x tippet, which is a lot of times where I live with wet flies. Okay, I'm going to tie a perfection loop, and then I'll add my little 6 to 8 inch connector of say 2x, and then I can have 3 to 4 foot of 4x, and I've got myself an 8.5 to a 9 foot, 9.5 foot leader there. So I skipped 1x, I skipped 3x, but that little 6 to 8 inch connector piece. So the point being is understanding that that monofilament connector that comes off there is 2x on the light trout and 0x on the trout, and then understanding how to build a tippet, or what some folks call a compound tippet, meaning that this is your tippet section off the front of this leader, but essentially you're continuing a taper and then you're adding the tippet. And I hope that that's going to prevent you from getting frustrated with casting and getting these leaders to turn over. This is such important information, and it's something that Airflo doesn't even share with folks. I'm quite frankly, I'm not even sure that they fully understand this concept of how the energy flows through there. So anyhow, like I said, you've got your intermediates. You've got the hover, the intermediate, the slow sink, the fast sink, and the super fast sink. For this style of wet fly fishing that we've been talking about here in 2025, I most often use the intermediate through the super fast sink. Loop to loop on that connection. Do a perfection loop in that monofilament connector as soon as you buy it, and that shouldn't ever go anywhere. And then you're going to put a perfection loop in the end of your tippet, or your, call it a compound tippet or taper. I also call it a transition piece. So you're transitioning from the 2x to the 6x by adding a piece of 4x in there. And that is just so wildly important. I promise you that your cast is going to be so much better. It's going to be really bad if you try to attach 6x to 2x. Okay? So, sorry to be so long-winded, but I really do like these things for certain applications. Again, I use them for larger dry flies, the floating version, for larger dry flies. When I go out to Montana and fish the stone flies or the grasshoppers, I do love the floating poly leaders. Again, though, you're going to have to stick with loops. That's just the case with poly leaders. And then when you're fishing wet flies and this style of fishing that we've been talking about here this season, again, you're going to have to go loop to loop. If you don't have a factory welded loop, you can make your own very easily. We've got several videos. You can search how to fix your broken loop, because this is what we do when that loop breaks, which it probably will. So anyhow, there you have it, friends. Sorry for so many words. I apologize, but I do love these things. I think there's been a lot of confusement. Is that a word, confusement? There's been a lot of confusion over these things, and I hate to see it when it really is super simple. And you can build these tippet sections. You can build those up and have them, have them ready to go with that perfection loop, and keep them in your leader wallet. And then you're not having to build this on the water. So you tie your perfection loop, tie one surgeon's knot between the 4x and 6x, and you got your pieces. There you have it, friends. Airflo Poly Leaders, which we've talked quite a bit about this spring. And by the way, as of right now, we do have these in stock. And we've talked to the folks at Airflo. They've been out of stock forever and ever and ever, and we apologize for that. But hopefully Airflo, they got their machines fixed, and now we're starting to get these in stock. So you should be able to find them at madriveroutfitters.com. Of course, we appreciate your support. Thanks for watching. Be sure to subscribe to our YouTube channel. Hop on over to our website and sign up for our monthly newsletter. And stay tuned. We've got a ton of fly fishing content coming your way.